Oliver, on this meeting, it's Robbie who's from the Western, on many of these, or on most of these sessions that we've had in the past. Brian Ash, who's from the Timberwatch Coalition, who's also in on this meeting, and they might want to ask you some questions a little bit later. I hope that they do also interject, provide some comments and some questions to you. Again,
Great.
thank you very much for being here. I don't think we've ever met physically, have we? I don't think so.
No,
Were
I met your
you?
son, but we
Okay,
haven't
you
met.
met Robert. Yeah. Okay, lekker. So Robert's also
Yeah.
on the call. Lekker.
Ah,
So
great.
yeah, the idea is it's part of a project that's supported by the Global Green Grants Fund, and the basic idea is to interview and get, learn from people such as yourself and some of the other activists that I've spoken to and that I plan to speak to in the near future. We try and do this every Wednesday and Sunday evening, and then we record it and we make it available on YouTube. Um, so yeah, we start normally with an introduction from yourself, just to give us a little bit of background to yourself, where you live, where you were born, what you do, how you came to be working as a plantations campaigner in the Global Forest Coalition. I think that's a journey that takes you to that space. Then we will talk a little bit about the impacts, and I suppose we'll sort of focus a little bit on industrial timber plantations, which is both of our main areas of interest or activism. And then we'll try and talk also a little bit about solutions, and that's difficult for me because I've been involved in this issue for such a long time, and it always seems as if we as civil society are on the losing side of the equation the whole time. It seems as if this industrial development just continues, and it's as if we are almost powerless to stop it.
Yeah.
I know that is not true, and that's why I want to just examine some successes and some civil society reactions and actions to try and curb this, what I definitely see as a threat. But to start at the beginning, if you can just give us an introduction to yourself, where you're from, and a little bit of, just give us a little bit of context to your life um, in Portugal.
Sure. Well, yeah. Well, thank you very much for inviting me onto this interview. Yeah, good to speak to you all. Yeah, I was born in northern England, but my folks moved our family, so me and my sister and my folks, to Portugal when I was about 2 years old. Yeah, my dad was given a short-term contract for the company that he was working for, but yeah, they didn't need to be here for long to realize that it was a great place to live, and so when the opportunity came up, they decided to stay, and they've been here ever since. So it must be, yeah, it's 35 years now or something like that. So it's very much home for well, for all of us in our family. So yeah, I left Portugal when I was about 19 to go and study in Scotland. Yeah, I mean, I didn't know much about the UK at the time, but I was pretty sure I didn't want to go and study in England, and Scotland seemed like a good option. And I'm very, very pleased that I made that choice, because I spent yeah, a fantastic and very formative 12 years in Edinburgh, where I became quite active in the activist community, in student politics, and in the anarchist community as well. Yeah, some fairly fun things happened whilst we were there. So we hosted the G8 summit in 2005, which was a great introduction to sort of, the anti-globalization kind of campaigning. Of course, that was the same time as the Iraq War and all of the mobilizations around that. But yeah, through my time at university, I was studying environmental geoscience, and I was interested in environmental science and and geoscience in particular, and was learning a lot about climate change. And yeah, obviously it's clear whenever anybody looks at it in any detail, you know, what the cause of the problem is. And so yeah, my studies were sort of deprioritized somewhat. I was, you know, in a very privileged position, as a lot of people are, that study in the UK or anywhere in the world, to have some free time. And yeah, it was because of that I got very involved in political stuff. So I was involved in anti-roads protests, lots of different things, but eventually centered in on coal, because at the time there was a lot of open cast coal mining happening in Scotland, mostly to power very dirty old coal-fired power stations. And in, I think it was 2009, myself and a load of other people from our activist community in Edinburgh initiated a campaign to try and stop new open cast mines from being developed, really. And so we occupied one in a place called South Lanarkshire. It was an area that traditionally had been they'd been underground mines, so they were deep mining communities. And then obviously through everything that happened in the sort of 70s and 80s, with Thatcher and the Tories, you know, destroying industry and unionism in particular, these communities were basically left, you know, in very socially deprived circumstances, and were basically forgotten about. And then through the sort of 90s onwards, open cast mining became the next thing, but obviously that employs a fraction of the people that the deep mines did, and you know, all it really does is takes from the area. It takes the natural wealth, but it also takes everything above ground, but it also takes the health of the communities, and that was one of the, you know, the main issues that the communities themselves, but also we in sort of solidarity with them were working on. So for, yeah, it was a good few years, maybe 6 or 7 years, we were campaigning against coal mining, against two companies in particular, and eventually a set of circumstances converged. Hopefully we had something to do with it, but the two main open cast companies went into administration, and over a short period of time, pretty much all of the mines closed, and all the plans for new ones were scrapped as well. So yeah, I suppose my background's mainly in anti-coal campaigning, but it was through that sort of activist community that I got involved in Biofuel Watch, which is one of GFC's UK-based member groups. And so yeah, I worked for Biofuel Watch for a few years, and because of the fact that Biofuel Watch is a GFC member, started to get more involved in GFC as well. And I think I've been working for GFC for yeah, probably about 6 or 7 years now. The first GFC event I was lucky enough to go to was our gatherings that we had in Paraguay. I'm really struggling to remember what year that was in now, but yeah, it was a good few years ago, and that was a great experience for me in terms of meeting lots of other GFC folks and member groups. We had meetings on bioenergy, but we also had meetings on livestock, on unsustainable livestock production. We went on field trips to visit communities, so peasant communities that had been impacted by soy plantations, and it was really great and eye-opening experience. So yeah, that was my involvement with GFC initially, and then in again, I'm sorry, I'm struggling.
Can I just ask Oliver,
Yeah,
with
please
regards
do.
to your to your activism anti-coal mine and the coal mines that got closed down in Scotland? What alternative energies did they move to, or are they just importing coal from other parts of the world, or how are they? What are they putting into their energy mix if they get less dependent on coal?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so a lot of the power stations have closed now in the UK, and so the main ones that were fed by Scottish coal have basically all closed now as part of the coal phase out plan. So, for example, Drax in the UK has mostly converted to biomass. Sorry, Obviously, that's just a whole nother problem that's been created, but that means that the demand for coal is a lot less. And so a lot of the coal that they were importing, so, you know, as well as burning local coal, they were importing a lot from Colombia and from Russia and from the US in particular. And so thankfully imports of coal have also decreased. But yeah, in terms of the energy mix, it's been replaced with some genuine renewables, so a lot of wind, some ungenuine renewables such as biomass, and a lot more natural gas as well, unfortunately.
Nuclear?
Nuclear, there hasn't been any new nuclear in the UK for a long time now, although there is still, you know, quite a large amount from when it was built decades ago.
Yeah. I'm asking because I'm interested in this this lifter technology, you know, what liquid fluoride thorium-based nuclear reactors, which apparently produces much less waste, much less, and the waste is much less radioactive. It's got a much shorter, much you know, less radioactivity to it, and it can actually be stored, you know, like 500 years, not exactly sure, before it's relatively safe, and it cannot be weaponized, you know. So plutonium is not a byproduct. Now that's one of the reasons why it's not being widely used and why they rather went for uranium, you know. Yeah, because I'm interested in this because I just don't see solar, and even here in our country where we have access to a lot of solar, and I know Brian is a big advocate of solar, and there is success stories in South Africa. I think there's quite a significant proportion of energy already created by these you know, solar and wind. But yeah, I don't think it's going to power you know, our economy, even if it is a economy that's based on less fossil fuel consumption, you know. So and of course, you know, solar power itself needs, you know, the solar panels, they need sense in mining in a sense, and also coal, because there's a lot of energy that's required into making the panels, and of course the batteries become a problem. I'd like to just hear a little bit more about the GFC, the Global Forest Coalition, and I mean it's such a nice coalition because it's so lively and so diverse in its membership, and it's always when you're involved with the GFC, it's a great learning experience always, from a wide variety of people and many different perspectives. But can you just give us a little bit more background on the GFC, like the different campaigns that they are involved with? I mean, you spoke a little bit about it earlier, but just a little bit more, please.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, so GFC now has 115 members. I think it is in 68 countries. So yeah, definitely very diverse groups from all over the world. And yes, you know, a strong and growing network. The main campaign areas that we work on are first of all women's rights and empowerment, which is sort of our central pillar at the moment. We also work a lot on climate change, and that's where the tree plantations angle comes into it. We work on unsustainable livestock farming, and on our newest campaign, which is called Extractive Industries, Tourism and Infrastructure. Yeah, so those are the main areas.
And you are specifically involved in the plantations campaign, and that's your main area of focus?
Yeah, so yeah, I'm a member of the climate team, so focusing on plantations and bioenergy mostly, but I'm also on the communications team and coordinate GFC's publications. So yeah, hopefully if people on this call see the things that we send out, so things like our forest cover reports or members newsletters or briefings, things like that, I'm usually quite.
No, the forest cover reports are absolutely great. No, it's a very valuable organization, and I'm sure you are happy to be part of it, because that's one of the more efficient and effective tools, you know, in working towards change, is building strong coalitions. Yeah. I want to just talk a little bit about in Portugal, some of them in your area where you stay. which are the main environmental issues that you face? Doesn't have to be just plantations, but what do you think are the main issues that is confronting society in your area?
I mean, in my area, it's definitely plantations, and so yeah, it was a sort of baptism of fire, if you excuse the pun, but I'll explain why now. Um, yeah, the area of Portugal I moved back to is like a central northern region, and it was very appealing when my partner and I moved here. Because, well, you know, scenically a lot of it is very beautiful. It's quite mountainous. There's like rivers that you can swim in the summer. There's a lot of sun. So in terms of growing things and the length of the growing season and what you can grow, it's fantastic. The climate's great. You know, and land is accessible. It's fairly cheap to buy land here because of the fact that there's been a lot of rural depopulation over the years, and you know, people to a large extent have left rural areas and moved to the cities. And so it's, you know, it's actually possible to be a small scale farmer here and be able to afford it, whereas in most places in Northern Europe, at least, it's just not possible. Yeah, and I suppose when I moved here, I was aware of the plantations issue, or at least, you know, what the problems with monoculture eucalyptus and monoculture pine are. And actually, Portugal has the highest proportion of eucalyptus anywhere in the world. So although it's a very small country, proportionally it has loads and loads. About 10% of Portugal's land area is covered in eucalyptus, but it's very much focused into the northern and central regions of the country, where I am. So I'm in a slightly more mountainous part, so you don't tend to get the really big extensive areas of plantations, which you do in the flatter regions, you know, a few tens of kilometers away from where I am. But there's an awful lot of eucalyptus.
Can I just ask you, are you currently like, can you describe yourself as a small scale farmer then in the area where you stay?
Yeah. Yeah.
And what kind of products do you farm with? And maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your farming work, and then we'll combine that with the activism.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, the reason I brought fire into it a second ago was because the first place that we were living in when we moved here was completely destroyed by fire in 2017, which was when we had the worst fires in living memory in Portugal. I don't know, maybe some of you will remember.
I remember that. I think I remember that more than 115 people died tragically in that fire.
Yeah.
No, it was horrendous. Also, the images that you saw on the you know, on the global media, it was just incredible that it could come to that, you know. But yeah, please go on.
Yeah. So. Yeah, so the farm we were living on previously, it's very small farm, was surrounded by pine and eucalyptus. A lot of it very poorly managed because it tends to be, or there it tended to be, individual private owners that had left the area and moved to the city and had planted tree plantations because I thought that was the only way they could make any money out of the land. But they basically plant it and then leave it for when in however many years, 12, 15 years time, when they can sell the woods, usually to the pulp and paper companies. But obviously, that abandoned, unmanaged land is a huge fire risk, basically. So when as I'm sure you'll know very well in South Africa, and as is the case in many other parts of the world, it's almost like this race course for fire where it can just move through the landscape extremely quickly. And so that's what happened in 2017. We were hit by the second sort of mega fire event. There's very, very little that you can do about it when in those conditions, when you're surrounded by the plantations like that. So that happened, and we decided that we'd leave that remote area that we were in, move about an hour away, which is slightly less remote. And we thought would be easier to protect from future fires, because obviously, the climate's only getting hotter and drier, and so fires are just going to become more and more of a risk. And so where we are at the moment, we've got about 2 hectares of land, about a hectare we're successfully managing. So we started from scratch, 2.5, 3 years ago, whenever it is now. And so we're using goats to manage the land for fire protection mostly, because they're just fantastic at controlling all of the really fire-prone species. Thankfully, we've not got any eucalyptus on our land. I mean, goats don't eat eucalyptus anyway, but they're really, really effective at managing all the other species. And then we've got about another hectare of forest that burnt 3 years ago, and that's being taken over by invasive species like acacias and things like that. But we're slowly but surely reclaiming it and trying to bring it back to what woodland should be like around here. So broadleaf species and native species, and trying to let the oaks recover, and planting chestnuts and walnuts and things like that. And the goats are helping with that as well. So at the moment we're mostly able to provide food for our small family, and making cheese and stuff like that off the goat's milk. But hopefully when we've got pretty more properly set up in a few years, we'll be able to start selling some of the produce from here as well.
Great. How many goats do you have, and how big is the property that you are managing?
It's 2 hectares, and we currently have 12 goats.
Okay.
Which sometimes
and
feels
are
like
you
a lot.
are you also off the grid, or are you still connected to the main grid in terms of water and power provision?
We're off grid in terms of water, so we've got what they call a water mine here, which is basically like a horizontal well. So basically, where a spring was, what people did for generations here was like dig or tunnel into the rock where the spring is to open it up as much as possible and create a header tank there. We're spring fed, which is brilliant, but we're connected to the electricity grid at the moment.
Tell me, the area that you moved from that was destroyed by fire. How was that land affected? Why did you find it necessary to actually just move away? Is it not possible to? And that area there, what's happening to it at the moment? Is it plantations just becoming more and more feral and more unmanageable?
Yeah, basically that's what's happening. There was actually a study published recently by the University of Coimbra, which is the nearest city to where I am, which found the highest concentrations of eucalyptus trees anywhere in the world outside of Australia since the fires. And so, I mean, we think of eucalyptus as being an invasive species anyway, normally. It turns out that fire is exactly what eucalyptus seeds need to germinate, and the level of propagation since the fire here is crazy. So I think from the published results, the highest concentration they found was 800,000 eucalyptus trees per hectare. And I was actually earlier watching a little video by one of the study authors that said something that they also found that they hadn't published, was one site that had 3 million eucalyptus trees in a hectare. And so I think some in normal plantations, I'm actually struggling to remember the figure now, but it's a few thousand trees per hectare is what you would normally expect in a managed plantation. And obviously, it's not going to be that concentration of trees forever. They'll outcompete each other and there'll be a lot of die-off. But basically what you have in these areas now is like you say, feral plantations that are completely unmanaged. And it's going to be such a big problem in the future. The other thing that this study sort of reported on was the fact that it's actually easy to manage invasive eucalyptus trees in the first sort of year or two after the fire, because you can just cut them with the brush cutter, and they don't come back. But once they become established, so after 2-3 years, once they start to reach about 2 meters in height, cutting them with the brush cutter with a chainsaw doesn't work, because obviously they coppice and just come back again. And so the only options are either to use a heck of a lot of herbicide, which obviously just creates another set of environmental problems, or to dig the roots out with a digger, which again is just going to completely destroy any soil that's left after the fires. And unfortunately, that window of opportunity for doing something about this post-fire eucalyptus invasion has well and truly gone. And so, yeah, at the moment, what you can do, or what we try to do, is manage the area that we're able to. Unfortunately, we've got neighbours that are also managing their land, and there's a lot more awareness after the fire about the problem with plantations, especially in terms of fire, and the fact that the only way to solve the problem long term is really to reforest with native species which are much more fire resistant, which keep the humidity in the soil, etc., etc. However, there's just such vast areas. I think it was 500,000 hectares burnt in 2017, and the vast majority of that is unmanaged at the moment. And so whether that's eucalyptus coming back, or it's pines that have self-seeded and are also coming back in an unmanaged way, or if it's acacias that are starting to dominate, they're all just resinous, fire-prone species that are so successful after fires.
And tell me, because obviously much of this responsibility should be laid at the door of the industry who develop those plantations in the first place. Are there any initiatives by them to try and manage for future fire risks, which obviously those unmanaged plantations are becoming even more so now that they are thicker and that they are, what's the industry doing about it? And then also, what is the government doing about it?
Well, the industry has had a total stranglehold on forestry-related policy in Portugal for many decades now. So the pulp and paper lobby, particularly the biggest pulp and paper company, which it's called the Navigator Company, they've exerted an extremely strong influence. They've got really big lobbying power. They're a huge PR machine. And so obviously they've gone on the PR offensive since the fires, and they try to really push back against any idea that eucalyptus is a problem, or if they do acknowledge it's a problem, they acknowledge that it's unmanaged is where the problem lies. And so with the big pulp and paper producers, the plantations that they own, they in general are much better managed. They've even got their own privately run fire service that's got trucks and planes and firefighters, specifically to protect their plantations. And I think it's something like maybe only 20% of the eucalyptus plantations in Portugal are operated by the plantation companies. The rest of it, it's all private individuals, so small landholders. I think the average plot size in Portugal is 1 hectare, and the land's very heavily privatized or private for small landowners. And so what the pulp and paper industry have done is deregulated forestry policy completely. So there's been a completely uncontrolled spread of plantations, and it's incentivized people to plant eucalyptus, but then just leave it completely unmanaged, because that's but then obviously they still accept the timber that's sold to them at the end of the rotation. So although they may not be directly responsible for the sort of the huge areas of unmanaged plantations, indirectly they are, because they're responsible for the forestry policy that's allowed it to happen, and they're responsible for providing the financial incentive to the small landowners. Unfortunately, it's just been a case of the policy being dictated to by the pulp and paper lobby, and they've largely just sat back over the course of decades and allowed these companies to get away with whatever they wanted to. There's no management of rural forest areas in this country, and that was shown very clearly by what has happened with the fires and what's happened since. And it was almost like the whole of the northern and central region was sleepwalking into this disaster, which could have been predicted, but was still obviously very shocking and took everyone by surprise, the scale of it. But I mean, this is what we see all over the world now. It's environmental problems that have been caused, completely exacerbated by climate change. So 2017 was the hottest year on record in Portugal, but it was also a really bad drought year. Fortunately, we haven't had the same levels of drought in the years since then, but it was almost like a perfect set of conditions which just allowed these mega fire events to be huge and for no one to be able to do anything about it, really. And so, yeah, the big danger now is that that's just going to keep happening unless there's a really significant change. Yeah.
Tell me, Oliver, are there certification bodies that works with those? Obviously, with the big companies, I suppose, and assume that they would be. But with the smaller and private growers, are they also certified by, for example, FSC?
I don't think the smaller ones tend to be. No. All of the plantations of the big operators are. But I don't think the smaller ones tend to be. No, a lot of it is unregulated. There was a heck of a lot of illegal planting that's gone on in the past, and a blind eye has been turned to that. So yeah, that doesn't play. I don't think it plays a big factor in terms of the small producers.
And can you talk a little bit about other civil society organizations, networks that's active on the ground, campaigning, about against timber plantations and this model of development?
Well, we've got two member groups in Portugal, Quercus, who's been our member for many years now, and Zero, who's a very very new member, and they both do some great work to try and encourage sensible management of rural and forest areas, and against new eucalyptus and pine any plantations, and towards reforestation with native species, and much more holistic land management systems. And I suppose one recent success was a law that was introduced to limit the expansion of eucalyptus areas. So theoretically now you can't plant eucalyptus where it hasn't previously been. Obviously there's still an awful lot of it, so when they reach their sort of third rotation, there's a lot of support for replanting with eucalyptus. But theoretically, at least, it can't spread anymore through planting, although as we've seen post fires, it's spread hugely without it being planted.
Yeah. And tell me the impact on water, as we really know well here in South Africa. It's just absolutely severe, and especially eucalyptus, and pine as well, because billions of trees use a lot of water. And of course, eucalyptus have got deep rooting systems. I'm aware of a study where they've measured the roots of eucalyptus penetrating 60 meters into the soil profile, So that's absolutely incredible. And there's not a lot of research that's happened with regards to, deep soil or deep soil water mining by eucalyptus, and the impacts are exerted on the groundwater. I want to ask you about the impacts on water in Portugal, and if people are responding to it, and if they are making the connection between catchment areas completely planted to hungry or thirsty timber plantations, and the fact that the water resources are diminishing.
Yeah, absolutely. That's definitely one of the big impacts here as well, very much so, and being made worse through climate change and drought conditions. So yeah, I mean, you definitely hear an awful lot of anecdotal evidence around here, where people talking about springs drying up, and because these areas previously were very populated, and all of the land was worked, and the landscape was a real mosaic of different uses, whether it was woodland or pasture or growing or any other uses that directly benefited the communities. But a lot of the older members of the communities always talk about the fact that there was more water, and that springs ran stronger, and that it was really easy to water all of your land with the water that came out of the hillside, rather than having to resort to taking it out of rivers or using boreholes or anything like that. But also the pulp and paper industry has done a lot of harm in terms of funding research, which has shown that eucalyptus doesn't have a significant impact on water consumption, or that it's no worse than pine or other sort of land uses or forestry uses. And so over the years, they've really successfully sown a lot of doubt, spread a lot of myths, So it does feel now like things are sort of finally coming to the surface, and there's there's a lot more public awareness or acceptance of what these issues are. Whether it's fire risk, or whether it's impact on the water table, or whether it's loss of soil. But it's so delayed because of all of the false information and denialism that's gone on over the years beforehand. So they're a very well-oiled PR machine as the pulp industry, and hopefully now there'll be a sort of sea change in opinion. But whether there's enough people and resources in the rural areas to make substantial changes is hard to tell, unfortunately.
Do you or civil society in general in Portugal have opportunity to engage government, engage Forest Stewardship Council, for example? These more formal structures which is supposed to govern the industry. Can civil society engage? Are there platforms where civil society can engage with industry, for example?
There are forums, there are opportunities to do that, but it's sort of, in my experience, it's very difficult for that to yield any results, and that is because of what you're up against, really. Portugal's main pulp and paper company is the largest producer in Europe. Its turnover is enormous compared to the budgets of civil society organizations. So it's definitely a very big uphill struggle. And as I was saying, decades and decades of institutionalized, influence over policy making, and over the levels of subsidies that are involved. Because that's another thing, is that as well as government support or European support, especially, or support from the European Investment Bank, or all these other sources of funding, the influence that the company has on policy is sort of directly paid for or repaid by subsidies and other financial incentives. And so it's this real vicious cycle of influence and impact that corporate lobbying has. It will take an awful lot to change that, really.
Yeah. Just reflecting a little bit on the monoculture nature of the model, and the fact that monoculture cannot be sustainable because successive rotations of monoculture must deplete the life in the soil. And another thing that I feel is proven is that diversity is really the key to life, and that soil that is diverse and full of microorganisms, nematodes, it's alive. But as soon as you reduce that diversity component, the soil starts to die, in effect. So in a way, to me, it feels as if the industry, for their own benefit, will have to transform, because it cannot continue. I mean, how many successive rotations can one actually get from timber plantations or from eucalyptus before the soil is impoverished and the plantations don't grow that well anymore? I know there's areas where industry has been have been putting more fertilizers down to compensate for this lack of nutrition in the soils, especially in the shallow soils. But can you reflect a little bit on that, the sustainability of the model, and then also a little bit about, the solution and the diversification, and as you've mentioned before, the utilization of indigenous timber species, which are less fire prone. Are there programs and organizations apart from yourself that's busy doing that you are aware of? Land restoration programs.
Fortunately, there are, definitely. So around here, there's been a lot of good work recently in areas of common land. So it tends to be the hilltops that are still commonly owned, or at least they're owned by a sort of organization of the local communities. And in the past, that system has been very heavily abused, and there's been all kinds of corruption that's gone on, whereby eucalyptus has been planted on these common lands. But since the fire, in a lot of places, there has been a lot of efforts to reforest with native species. So yeah, chestnut is one of the main ones here. So traditionally, you know, it's one of the main food sources. It's been a really important building material. Yeah, chestnuts are just a brilliant trees. And that sort of culture has been slowly disappearing as the chestnut trees have. But now, thankfully, a lot more are being replanted. And there's great examples nearby of that happening. Also, you know, a lot of the civil society and the main NGOs here are also involved in conservation and reforestation projects, which is great, and you know, give some sort of hope, or at least, you know, maybe provides a model for how it can be you know, done on a larger scale in future. And at the end of the day, what a lot of it boils down to is being able to you know, find value in the land and from people being here. So how you can sustain yourself, or how can landowners make money off the land that's not planting plantation trees. And obviously that's like such a low return per hectare. Things like eucalyptus and pine, especially in Portugal, where generally the yield is so low. It's really like the simplest but least value thing that you can do, but it's what you know, over the course of many years, people have come to see as the only thing you can really do. But you know, with things like white chestnuts, where the chestnuts themselves that you can harvest are worth far more than any eucalyptus or pine that you could grow on the land. It's finding ways to really to be able to encourage people and to support people to live off the land in a way that is beneficial to the land and to biodiversity as well. And that's the thing that should be focused on. That's the only way to you know, get people back into the area, so that there is enough people to effectively manage the land and to do it in a way that reduces fire risk and increases biodiversity. Yeah,
that's nice and positive. I want to talk a little bit about this you know, energy from biomass, which is becoming a huge global problem and another driver for plantations establishment. But before I get to that, I just want to ask, because we don't have that much time left. We've got about 15 minutes left. And I just want to ask, before I move on to biomass, if there's anybody in this group that's got a question for Oliver or a comment. You just unmute yourself and ask the question.
Hello?
Yes, we can hear you.
Hey, Ollie, how's it going, man?
Good.
Hi, Robert. I'm good.
Okay, good to see you as well. I find it interesting to go back to something you said right at the beginning. You spoke briefly about, you know, being part of the anarchist community at your university, and I find it interesting listening to these talks that, especially on the grassroots level, you know, people that are really involved on the ground with environmental issues and seeing the impact that a lot of these people identify not with, say, the classical current economic system, capitalism. There's often this feeling that, you know, activists and environmental activists especially, you know, advocate for some different kind of governance. So I wanted to ask, do you think there's a link, or there's a greater importance to that link, where we say, okay, can there be true conservation within the current economical and political system, or is it something that we really need to look at and it's only possible out of, say, community conservation and more on the ground work? And then kind of as an add-on, you know, what is the role of industry? Because through hundreds of years or tens of years, the problems that we face today has been caused by the drive for profits. And then these problems to rehabilitate is an incredibly expensive and time-consuming process. So, you know, do you think there should be pressure, or there should be a place for government or industry to address their problems, or do you think really we need to say, okay, let's move away from dependence on big capital, let's call it that, and that the problem should be addressed on a community level through community-driven incentives? I'm not sure if that's the right term, but I hope you understand what I'm asking. Cool.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, good question. Yeah, I'm also very interested to hear what all of your opinions on this is as well. Yeah, I mean, this sort of links into when I was thinking about this interview, and I think one of the things that that Philip had mentioned in the invitation email was thinking about like best practices for forestry models, and I was wondering what that might look at, and I think the two ones that I could think of were Nepal's community forestry model and an example of the MST, the landless people's movement in Brazil, where they have reclaimed plantation areas for their own communities and growing food on. And so both of those involve the control being given back to the communities and the profit incentive of private businesses being removed. And as you were just saying, Robert, I mean, I can't really see any other way forward. So, I don't know how long corporate social responsibility has been the buzzword for, in terms of capitalism's ability to do good if it's, if the right ideas are presented or enough funding is put in certain directions, it just doesn't work. And you see it more and more nowadays in terms of the greenwash around like nature-based solutions, or even the UN's Green Climate Fund, which is supposed to fund climate mitigation, being increasingly focused on tree plantations and bioenergy and things like that, which are false climate solutions. And so, looking at Nepal, for example, the model there is that an act was passed in Parliament whereby large areas of Nepal's forests, or Nepal's rural areas, were given over to community ownership. And so it's a legal and formalized process that recognizes the customary rights to land, to use and to access of the communities that live there. And it's a whole series. I think there's something like 35,000 community forestry user groups in Nepal that manage forests, that manage these forest areas. And they can decide what to do with them. Inbuilt into the process, it needs to be benefit sharing, especially for the poorer elements of society. So really making sure that everyone is cared for within the community and within the user group, they can basically decide what to do with it. So they manage it for their needs. If they want to extract timber or need to for using it to heat their homes or to cook on, then they're able to do that. But because they have a direct relationship with the land being there, and in order to sustain their communities, the forest has to be sustained as well. They do great work in terms of conservation, and it's had really massive impacts in terms of increasing the forests that are being protected in Nepal, increasing the health of forests, all that sort of thing. So I think that's a really valuable model to look at, and for other places to think about doing as well. But again, it depends on taking away the profit incentives of private interests. So you don't let companies have such control over big areas of land, which causes so many problems all over the world. But you let communities make the decisions and have governance rights over these areas of land. And in most instances, it has a really positive effect on the land in question. Like, I don't know if there's similar models in South Africa or examples of communities doing that. It'd be great to hear about it. And the other example I was given with the MST in Brazil, they obviously have huge problems of being surrounded by eucalyptus, encroaching on all of their lands. There also being a large number of vulnerable and poor and marginalized communities. And what they do is they band together, take back areas of land, and manage it for themselves and grow food on it and provide housing for their communities. And that's also a really great model, which very clearly has a direct benefit between protecting and enhancing biodiversity and protecting and enhancing the livelihoods of rural people. I don't know if that was a very probably roundabout answer to your question.
No,
that would be great to hear what you think about that as well.
That was great. Thanks for that. I find it funny in environmental sociology, you hear about this, or this idea pushed by intellectuals saying, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, and only once all your other bases have been covered, then you can start worrying about your environment. But in communities around the world, it should be turned around on its head, because the main need is for a healthy environment. And it's so obvious if you hear these stories and you speak to these people that's complete BS. This notion that if we grow the economy and everyone is well off, then only then will issues of the environment be important to people. But it's the complete opposite. But yeah, thanks for your answer, man. Nice talking to you.
Thanks, Robert, for asking question. Anybody else that wants to quickly ask a question to Oliver?
Yes, good evening, everyone. My question is to you, the speaker. Sorry, I can't see the name again now. That in South Africa, we're finding that environmental activism is becoming very dangerous. You either become targeted as an individual, a leader, or you are targeted as a community. But most especially when a person is targeted as a leader of that certain community. I wanted to know if is it the same thing in Portugal? Do you feel that it's not safe to speak about these issues? And how is it, and how do you deal with it if it's not safe here?
Yeah, thanks very much for your question. It's basically nothing like it is in South Africa or in many other places of the world where, as you said, speaking out leads to a direct threat of violence on yourself or on your community. We're extremely fortunate here in Portugal and other places in Europe. It was the same when I was into direct action in Scotland. Generally speaking, as a European person, as a white person especially, you're protected from all of the violence that's perpetrated on other people all around the world. This is something also that GFC tries to focus on as much as possible. So we have, one of our sort of cross-cutting campaigns that runs throughout all of them is on defending the environmental defenders. And so we try to support member groups with small amounts of money when, there's either physical or legal threats against them. And, we really tried to highlight the fact that, so many people are killed every year all over the world, for standing up for their rights and for the rights of the environment. But yeah, in Portugal, thankfully, the risk really isn't that high. And it's sort of because of that I personally feel anyway, and this was certainly how I felt when I was living in Scotland, that you therefore have the responsibility to do everything that you can, legal or otherwise, to have an impact or to make a difference. And so one of the things that we tried to do in Scotland to stop open cast mining was to put ourselves in the way as much as possible. And because we could be fairly confident that being arrested or whatever wouldn't lead to a big physical threat or threat of violence or whatever, that was something that we were able to do as part of our activism. But obviously it's just so much harder for people to do that everywhere else in the world, and it's so important for us to have solidarity with that. But yeah, fortunately in Portugal, it's at the moment anyway, we don't feel that anywhere near the same level of threat.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much for your answer. Yeah.
Actually, could I ask you a question quickly? How do you as activists or communities that do have to live with this, threat of physical violence, how do you deal with that as communities, and how does it impact what you do?
Well, I think it's becoming very scary and than before, because we've got some people, that have been killed, just because they are activists or, fighting for the environmental rights, but also for their rights, because it's not just the environmental rights, it's the rights of people for their livelihoods and so many things. I think it's not very easy the way I see it at the moment, because it's this side, it's the government and the companies. So in most cases, the companies have got the cover up, from the government, and then the people are on their own. I think the only thing that I think is effective, though, is to build more activism on the ground, not to be the only person, speaking, to have many other people with you speaking, and not to be the ringleader, but to have many leaders saying the same thing. And the reason I say that is because I can see in 2 communities where these killings have happened, that although they have targeted the leaders, but the other leaders are remaining, and they are not being scared to speak out. So at the moment, that's the only way I see it. And of course, yes, the law may help, but it's a very long process for communities who don't have money to have lawyers and everything, unless they have support of other environmental defenders, let's say from other countries, from Europe or anywhere else, who can support them. Otherwise, it becomes very difficult. And therefore, sometimes you ask yourself, what do I choose here? Do I choose myself and the family? Do I choose the rights of the community? And sometimes to navigate within that, it's not always the easiest, So you find yourself wanting to lean in, to be on the other side of the family and not to speak out, or to be with the community. So I think it's a combination of factors that makes one to decide on the strategy. But in the long run, being with other leaders, on the ground is the best. Yeah, thank you.
And so, like, that sort of international solidarity is a useful thing then. So what kinds of support do you think a coalition like GFC can best be placed to do? So, like providing financial support and stuff like that. Oh, I think you're muted.
Sorry. Yeah, definitely. Financial support is one thing that can be mobilized for grassroots organizations, but also I think, platforms like this, for the people to tell their story, of how it's like, because in most cases, people don't really understand what it's like to not to have your natural resources, something that really makes not just your economic life, but your spiritual life, your many other things, that make you to be. So platforms like this are very helpful, in my view, to tell the story, and not for the story to be told by academics only, but to be told by the people who feel, how it's like.
Yeah. Great, thank you.
Philip?
Yeah, I'm happy to stay longer if there are other questions or other people want to input.
Well, I'm wondering if people are load.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, I'm not sure if Philip is there. Load shedding in South Africa is kicking in.
I am here, Brian.
Okay. Yeah. No.
Yeah, I'm still here. Sorry, I was just
okay.
wanting to ask Oliver about the Portuguese influence in Mozambique and plantations establishment in Mozambique by Portuguese firms.
Yeah. actually, that just reminded me, that was going to be my answer to your question about how the forestry model, the plant monoculture model can be sustainable if, it depletes water resources so much. Yeah, and that's, I mean, here definitely, once you've had, I don't know, 3 plantings on 3 rotations, you just can't grow anything out. There's just nothing left anymore. It's, it takes some really serious input to make things grow again. And so, as you said, putting more and more fertilizer is something that's done. But as Europe has always done, another approach is to externalize the environmental impact. So obviously Portugal was the colonial power in Mozambique previously, and now through neocolonialism and the influence of this big corporation, the Navigator Company, which is called Portugal Mozambique, has been given access to a huge amount of land in northern Mozambique in order to grow eucalyptus on. I think it's 300,000 hectares, which is more than they manage in Portugal. So that's clearly the model of this company is, with hopefully increasing regulation in Portugal, it's not able to expand its plantation areas as it once could. Where it has plantations, the soil's so depleted, it's not going to be able to keep replanting forever. And so it just externalizes it to Mozambique. And in fact, supposedly this year, the first shipments of wood chip from Mozambique to Portugal are going to happen. And so, yeah, there'll just be increasing amounts of eucalyptus being grown there to be turned into pulp and paper in Portugal. And yeah, hopefully you would have seen recently our member group in Mozambique, Justiça Ambiental, had an article in our latest report on the influence of corporate capture on forest policy, where they describe some of the impacts on the communities there and the really unfair processes that have led to state-owned land being given over to the Navigator Company. And it's land that people depended on. I think it's something like 30,000 families that depended on that land for food growing and for their own food security. And initially a lot of them were won over by the false promises that the companies made. So it would be putting in new roads, it would build new schools, it would build new wells, all of these sorts of promises which are made all over the world and never kept. Has happened in Mozambique, and the communities just feel like a deep injustice has happened, and like they were totally lied to, basically, with false promises. I think only a very small proportion of what the concessions that have been given have actually been planted yet. So a very tiny fraction of it. So although they're going to start sending shipments over, there's still a really big opportunity to support communities in Mozambique and to support the civil society there, to make sure that the planting doesn't happen on any bigger scale.
Yeah. Well, it's also activism that needs to take place on a because it seems as if this global interconnectedness places so much pressure, not on it seems as if the people basically have no say in the use of the land, and that is decided on some kind of other level, a higher level, which we need to access more effectively. Can I ask you to reflect a little bit upon biomass and that as a threat when it comes to plantations, and a little bit about the global nature of the biomass energy business?
Yeah, absolutely. I was actually, I visited a pellet factory not far from here yesterday, because with GFC, a number of our member groups are doing some work in Portugal at the moment to look at the impacts of biomass burning here. And what, that pellet factory, as is the case in almost all of them, is the use of whole trees. So rather than it being forestry residues that are being burnt, so the argument that's used is it's residues from forestry processes that need to be burnt, because if they aren't, they'll be left in the forest and there'll be a fire hazard. And so, well, it's this idea that in order for land to be safe from fire, you have to clear it, or if there's nothing there to burn, then it can't burn, which I don't know, may have some logic in terms of a fire prevention strategy, but has none whatsoever if you're also talking about protecting biodiversity, helping to mitigate climate change, and provide communities with what they need to live somewhere. And so, yeah, as is the case in many places in the world, especially in Europe and North America, what you're seeing is whole trees, whether from plantations or from forests, being turned into wood pellets to be shipped somewhere far away, burnt in power stations to produce electricity. And what that comes down to is the fact that biomass, as with all bioenergy, is seen as renewable. And that's because of the myth that, if you cut a tree down, another tree can grow. And that means that it's a renewable process, and it means that you don't have to account for the carbon that is produced, that's burned into the atmosphere. And so, with renewable energy targets being adopted all over the place, it's particularly a problem in Europe at the moment. One of the ways that governments think they can easily meet those renewable energy targets without having to put, any thought really into how we need to seriously reorganize society instead, is to use biomass instead. And so in the EU now, biomass accounts for a huge amount of the renewable energy that's produced. It's something like 2/3. It's a very major stake in what's considered renewable. So we think about things like you've already mentioned, like solar and wind, but actually it's burning whether wood or biofuels or things like that. That's really the major contributor. And this has obviously been proliferated around the world, through the Paris Agreement and other UN conventions where biomass and bioenergy is seen as renewable and where the emissions don't have to be accounted for. And it, of course, is just another big driver of forest loss or of plantation expansion. It's another way for companies to make money off of this monoculture and intensive forestry model. And it's something that we really need to look at. The impacts of it are pretty clear, in Europe and North America, where the industry has really taken off. And what's really important now is to make sure that the finance and the hype around it isn't translated into other areas of the global south. So one of the things that's happening at the moment, I think it's probably the case in South Africa, but I'd be really interested to hear as well, is that pulp mills are building biomass power stations next to them, basically, as another way to take advantage of, money that can be made through that model. So whether it's selling subsidized electricity or selling carbon credits, it's just looking for another way to burn the wood or utilize the wood that's going to make them more money. And that's happening in many different places, in Chile, in Brazil, and lots of other places.
No, it's happening here. I mean, our local Nongodwana pulp mill, which is now also producing a lot of cellulose, I think as their main line, but they also produce power from residue. Yeah, and I mean, with regards to removing that biomass from the plantation compartments, there is an alternative management strategy, which some of the industry are employing or used to employ, is by packing rows and composting that material to prevent a fire hazard. But it's just like you say, it's denuding the forest floor of any potential life, even sort of a fungi dominated system, because in our area here with the grasslands, it's bacterial dominated. And when you change to the system to big monoculture timber plantations, it changes to a sort of a fungal dominated system. So it's been theorized that that it becomes better for growing trees, but it's worse and worse and worse for growing the indigenous biodiverse grassland plants that we had. And it said that there's something like 4,000 different kinds of indigenous plants that you can find in the local grasslands. So it's just incredible, this impact on biodiversity. Can I ask Brian, maybe if you've got a question, or Sibongile, another follow-up, Robbie? Any questions for Oliver at this stage?
Well, on my side, no question really, but I think that was a good question from his side on what the nature of these relationships between the North and the South in terms of supporting each other. I think it's something that needs to be explored all the time. Yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Sibongile. Robbie, Brian, anything else you want to add? Okay, then I want to ask you, in our last, and I thank you very much for affording a little bit more time to this, but what do you think, as you've mentioned many solutions, but if you can just off the top of your head, the primary thing that you see we as civil society or as a global community should focus on and do when it comes to timber plantations, what would it be?
And that's a good question. Yeah. Well, I think a big one is which was the focus of our last report, which is trying to break this vicious cycle of corporate influence over policy making and subsidies and incentives for the industry. Yeah, I think that's the thing that really has the stranglehold over the model at the moment. We really are going to need to break that in order to be able to promote, community governance of rural and forest areas, which is the biggest hope for being able to rehabilitate biodiversity, sustain people's livelihoods. Obviously, how we go about doing that is another question entirely, and I think there's going to have to be lots of different approaches and tactics and angles. But basically, where the private sector is able to have so much influence and so much decision-making power, you're always going to have these really large-scale environmental problems, no matter what the industry is, whether it's timber plantations or any of the other things which are causing such harmful impacts. Breaking the power of corporations and of private capital is probably the priority. But I would also be very interested to hear what you think. The focus.
Well, I think it's always necessary to promote an alternative that is something that people are willing to strive for, and I think that idea and that model that you are basically living, is going back to the land, doing the restoration, becoming self-sufficient, cultivating diversity, promoting diversity to be cultivated, being part of global or local and national and international networks and getting, spreading the word. Yeah. Mm-hmm. That's what we should do. I really think also lobbying industry, of course, to say, hey guys, you must recognize that you are not sustainable, that you have massive impacts, and that for your own benefit, you have to change. You have to incorporate diversity. You have to, in our area, there's one team left. It's the only team that I know of in our country that still operates with horses and mules. That is something that we support, because it's less compaction, it's more labor intensive, it's more diversity, it's a little bit of compost, it's less use of fossil fuels. Mm-hmm. So, a little bit of moving backwards, but again, it involves a bigger change than that, because it's a sort of reflection of the way that people generally live, mm-hmm. And there's been a kind of a consensus from many of the previous participants and guests on this forum, that people should learn to live more simply, we need to take less in order to generate less mining projects, for example. Yeah. But yeah, mm-hmm. Any closing comments from your side, and if anybody else wants to raise their hand or say something, you are more than welcome. It's really nice to have a couple of people attending and listening in and being able to ask, and because it sometimes direct the conversation in another direction, which is always good. So I want to thank everybody that participated in tonight's event, and especially you, Oliver. Thank you very much for your time, and thanks a lot for the work that you do, and the energy and the professionalism the dedication that you put into your job. And I mean, that's what we need as a global community. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you very much for inviting me, and for listening, and all of your inputs as well. And I mean, yeah, GFC is nothing without its member groups. So yeah, thank you for all of the work that you do, because that's really what gives the it's what is the driving force behind the coalition. So it's great to talk to you more, and to get to know you all better. And
okay. Thank you very much. Okay, Oliver. Cheers.
Great. Speak to you soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so now it's Robbie, Brian, and me that's still on, eh?
Yeah, Philip, I might disappear. We got load shedding stage 2 back again, and we scheduled for 9 o'clock. We just made it in time. I was a bit worried. But
tell me what happened? Did you just log in with those details?
Let me just stop the recording, and then, because otherwise you got to edit it.